And good morning once again, my brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ. What a great opportunity we have one more day to study God's Word, and I want to say thank you for being here. Today we find ourselves in Mark chapter 2, and as we progress through Mark's Gospel, we're going to see something escalate, and that's simply the opposition against Jesus' ministry is going to continue to escalate from here all the way to the cross. Jesus is showing people that he does what only God can do. He casts out the demons. He heals the leper. The paralytic picks up his mat and walks. And the more Jesus does this, the more Jesus uses these occasions to expose the false religion of Judaism in Jesus' day. They had changed what God had said. They had massaged what God had done to make Judaism into a rules-based, ritualistic, self-righteous religion. We can earn our way to heaven. We're good enough for God. He likes us best because we have Abraham's blood flowing through our veins. We are his chosen people, and oh yeah, we keep the law. They just ignored the fact that nobody keeps the law. But they had to dumb the law down to a place where they felt like they were truly doing righteous things that would be counted by God in their favor and that they could earn their way to heaven. Well, Jesus relentlessly attacks them. He's not looking for middle ground. He's not trying to meet them halfway. He is attacking them. Let me show you what happens in today's passage. In today's passage, we read this. One Sabbath, notice, immediately Mark brings us to a place of understanding this isn't happening on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. This is happening on Saturday, the Sabbath, the Jewish Sabbath. Why is that so important? Because the religious elite of Jesus' day had brought the whole nation to a false understanding that on the Sabbath there were rules that had to be kept. There were rules that were unviolatable, if that's a word. Look at this. We're told one Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields. Now, remember that in his day and age, the road, there was no superhighway system. People walked. That was the major way of transportation. And when they walked, they had little paths, and those paths went through fields. And occasionally they were grain fields. And as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. So here we are. It's the Sabbath. You can't do any work. That's the legalistic view of the Jewish elite in Jesus' day. They began to pick some heads of grain while all the red flags for the Jewish leaders went up. You are working on the Sabbath. Now, where does all this come from? Let's go back to Deuteronomy and listen to what the Old Testament really taught. If you enter your neighbor's grain field, in other words, just like Jesus' disciples are doing, you're walking through a field on a path, moving from A to B, you may pick kernels with your hands. There's nothing wrong with that. Go ahead. You're hungry. There's harvest right in front of you. You want to have some kernels, have a little snack? Go ahead. It says, but you must not put a sickle to his standing grain. I mean, we don't want you to harvest your neighbor's field and take his stuff. But if you need to eat while you're walking through his field, go ahead. There's not a prohibition against that. Well, the Pharisees, back to Mark 2, they say to Jesus, look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? There is the issue. You guys are violating the Sabbath. You're working. Well, how does Jesus answer that? Listen to this. And he answered, have you never read? And before we move past this, you got to get this. To tell a bunch of religious elite, well-educated, Old Testament studied leaders, to ask them the question, hey, haven't you read? Haven't you read what? Your Old Testament that you've studied all your life? It's like, okay, let me just smack you one and wake you up to the fact that maybe you've read it, but you don't understand what you're doing. Jesus says, have you never read? It would have been an insult to them for sure. Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? Now, you just have to go to 1 Samuel 21 to read this whole story, but Jesus is going to tell us right here the summation of it. In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread. Hey, wait a minute. You think walking through somebody's field and doing what you're allowed to do in Deuteronomy 23 is bad? You remember what David did? He went into the house of God. This is the holy place. He's eating the bread of the holy place, the consecrated bread. And Jesus admits, look, which is lawful only for priests to eat. So David rolls in and eats it. Well, he's fleeing from Saul in this story. The King Saul is going to be replaced by King David, but it hasn't happened yet. And by the time you get to 1 Samuel 21, the chase is on. Saul is looking for David, trying to kill him. David goes into the temple, or the house of God. He eats the consecrated bread. Only priests are supposed to do that. And it says he also gave some to his companions. So here, King David, the one you guys revere, did exactly what my disciples are doing, is in essence what Jesus told these religious leaders. In your book, these guys would have been violating the law, just like you're accusing my guys of violating the law. Well, in Matthew's account of this encounter, we see a few details added. Listen to this. Jesus asked the same question, or haven't you read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple desecrate the day and yet are innocent? In other words, you guys, don't you know your law well enough to understand that the priests, they work all day on the Sabbath making these sacrifices, but they're not held guilty for that, and yet they are innocent, right? God doesn't judge them for doing what God told them to do in worship to Him on the Sabbath. I tell you, here we go, Matthew embellishes what Mark says. I tell you that one greater than the temple is here. Oh, now we're going to shift to the question of who Jesus is. He's once again going to tell them the truth, but they cannot handle the truth. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. Now, this is so important to get. God is not after sacrifice, as if you, in their case, do the sacrifices of killing the animals in the temple and shedding the innocent blood on behalf of the guilty. If that's all it took, then we could just do that enough to earn our way to heaven. And Jesus is saying, look, that's not the way. Mercy is the way. Live the way God told you to live. Obey Him. Do what He said. Don't massage His truth into something that was never meant to be. You guys are condemning the innocent. That's Matthew's addition to the story. You could read Luke's addition too, but let's go back to Genesis for a minute and just remember what the Sabbath is about anyway. How did it start? Well, way back in Genesis 2, by the seventh day, God had finished the work He had been doing, so on the seventh day, He rested from all His work. What's the Sabbath about? The Sabbath is about not working. Now, they had added and piled on all these restrictions to bind the people, but the Jewish leadership was wrong. The only thing God really says is don't do your normal job on the Sabbath. Rest. Okay? It's very interesting. And God blessed the seventh day and made it holy because on it He rested from all the work of creating that He had done. That's what the Sabbath is about. That's the point. God says, look, rest. Rest. That's all. There's no prohibition from doing anything. It's just that you're not supposed to do your normal job. It's not a day of commerce. It's not a day of, keeping your business working. It's a day of leaving your business down, setting it down, and being free from it for that day to worship God, to enjoy your family. It's not a prohibition otherwise. Well, they don't like that. For sure they don't like that, because they've built this whole system about rules-based religion to make sure that people keep the rules if they do any kind of work. In fact, just a little sideline for you. I have a neighbor who's a devout Jewish person. I was in my garage on a Saturday. Here comes the neighbor. He says to me, well, somebody left a car in my driveway and I need your help. Well, what can I do to help you? Well, you need to get in that car and drive it out of the driveway so my kids can play basketball. I do? Why can't you drive it out of the driveway so your kids can play basketball? Because I'm not allowed to do any work on the Sabbath. Even in modern Judaism, people are tied up by these senseless restrictions that God never brought to bear. They're tied up in legalism, in that self-righteous desire to be good enough for God through their own behaviors. Well, what does Jesus say to these guys? Back to Mark 2. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. What's he talking about? God's the one that sets the restrictions on what the Sabbath is, and he's only said don't work. You guys have turned this whole thing into some legalistic, self-righteous, ritualistic event every week from sundown on Friday night to sundown on Saturday night. You guys have missed the whole point. You've missed the whole point. Well, here it comes. This is the same kind of thought that's eventually going to get Jesus brought to the cross. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath. The Son of Man, who's that? Well, that term refers to Jesus' humanity in some places, but it most of all refers to his deity. From Daniel 7:13, he's saying he's God by referring to himself as the Son of Man. But then, as a total offense to these guys, he says, look, I'm the one that's Lord of the Sabbath. I establish what can and cannot be done on the Sabbath. You have misinterpreted the Old Testament. You have bound people with legalistic rules that have no application. God never spoke about these things and forbid certain behaviors or restricted things. I mean, they had things down like, you can't carry something a certain distance. If you go one step beyond that distance, then you've violated the law. I mean, just such a restrictive, hard restriction on people. It was just crazy. It still is. But in the end, Jesus says, look, you guys think you get to define the Sabbath? I'm the one that defines the Sabbath because I'm God. You want to make some guys mad? Tell the religious leadership that you're God and that you get to control this most holy day that they have built their whole ritualistic system around. See what happens. Well, I'll take you to John's Gospel to help you understand the response. For this reason, the Jews tried all the harder to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, this is when he healed the man by the pool of Bethesda who had been laying there for 38 years. He just said, get up, take up your mat and go home. Well, they didn't care about the miracle. What did they want? They wanted to try harder to kill Jesus because he's breaking the Sabbath. He did it on the Sabbath in John 5 as well. But he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. They understood exactly what Jesus was saying, and instead of evaluating his claim that he's God, after all, he is doing what only God can do. Instead of yielding to him and surrendering to him, worshiping him as the Messiah, they tried all the harder to kill him. A little farther into John, some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. In other words, the Messiah would be one who yielded to the rules that we've made up. But others asked, how can a sinner do such miraculous signs? And so they were divided. This is one of the central issues that takes Jesus to the cross. Who do you think you are? Well, Jesus is clear about who he is. I am Lord of the Sabbath. Go further on in the New Testament, you find that Jesus is the creator and sustainer of life, that Jesus is the author of creation, that Jesus is the one that is the Lord of the Sabbath, Lord of all. But the religious leadership of Jesus' day cannot see it. Their goal is to bind people up by restrictive laws that God never commanded. So we end today in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 11 when Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." What is this talking about? Like, oh, you haven't been sleeping well, and if you come to Jesus, he's going to give you rest. You're going to be able to take a nap. What is this talking about? This is talking about, I will unburden you from that religious system that requires you to be a slave to those laws, to those rules, to those restrictions. Instead, if you come to me, you'll experience salvation. I'll give you rest from that idea that you have to be good enough for God. You come to God through faith, through Jesus Christ. You can rest that your salvation is secure because of what he's done. You don't have to earn it because God gives it freely through his grace to all who believe, to those who follow him. That's the point of Matthew 11:28. And for us, church, we can look at this today and say, the Lord is the Lord of the Sabbath. As he declares it, we will see the conflict escalate. But for today, we'll serve him by acknowledging who he is and doing our very best in the power of his Spirit to obey all that he's commanded. I pray that you serve him well today, church. God bless you.